All right, let's continue with our server-side form validation. So right now, we have this, our make reservation form, and that actually puts an empty form object in there that we can use for validation. And under our code, under errors, we've defined a type errors that will hold our errors, which is a map of type string with every value associated with that index of string being a slice of strings, because we might have more than one error for a given field in a form. That's why it's a slice. We have a function to add errors, which will append an error and a message and associate it with a particular field. And we have a function to check and see if there are errors and return the first error if there is one. Okay, so that's for that part. And under forms, we have our type that describes the form data that we're going to add errors to, if any exist. And we have new, which allows us to create a new form, a new empty form. And we have this one check, has, which isn't finished yet. And you may have noticed that if you were paying attention. But let's go through the process of how we actually handle posted form data and perform server-side validation. So I'm back in my handlers file, and I'm looking at that empty function we created last time called post reservation. What's the very first thing I want to do? It is good practice when you are parsing form data to do this. Create a variable called error and assign it a method that's built on the request called parseForm. And that's it. So you try to parse the form data. And if there's an error, you take the user somewhere, you display it, whatever it may be. But all we're going to do right now is to say if error is not equal to nil. In other words, if there's an error parsing that form data, then we'll just log it. Print line, log the error, and we'll return. So they'll get a blank screen. They're not going to see anything. We'll make this better later on when we handle errors in a more sophisticated fashion. So I've parsed that form data. Now what do I do? Well, think about what we want to do here. On my make reservation page, I have 4 pieces of data. Well, actually 5. One is the hidden form for the CSRF token, but we're not doing anything with that. We're just letting our middleware make sure that this form is being posted from a page on our site, and it's not some malicious user who's written a script to access our forms as many times as he or she possibly can just because they're nasty. So we only have 4 we care about. We have first name, we have last name, we have email, and we have phone. Now I could, if I wanted to, back in my handler, actually create 4 variables, first name, last name, email, and phone, and keep track of all of those. But it's common practice when I have data that's all associated with one another. Let's create a new model. So I'm going to go to my models, and I'm going to open, let's see here, what shall I do? I can just put it right here. Actually, no, let's create a new file called models. New Go file, models.go. Because the name of that one, and I will add this, the name of that one is our template data. Here's where we're going to store all of our models. And eventually, these models will be used to store things in a database, to get data from a database and store them in these models. But right now, we're just going to create one. And I'll create a model, which I will call, obviously, reservation. So let's create a type of reservation, which is a struct, and it has one field for each of the kinds of information I need to store in that. So first name, and I'm going to export it because I want it to be available outside of the models package, and it's a string. And we'll have last name, email, and phone, all of which are strings. Last name, email, and phone. And I'll give that a nice comment. Reservation holds reservation data. Okay, so now I've created that type. So back in my handlers, let's open this up. And let's actually store that data right in a reservation object, which we just created. So I'll create a reservation object like this. Reservation, which is just a variable name. And that's going to be a type models.reservation. And I'm actually going to populate it with the information that the user posted from the form. Even though it might be bad data, I'm going to save it. So first name is going to be equal to, and how do we get something from a post request? r.form.get and the name that I want, which happens to be first name. And then last name, which is assigned the value of r.form.get last name. And one for email and one for phone. So I'll just do it this way. Phone, email, phone, and email. Okay, So now I've populated this reservation variable as a struct of type models reservation, and I've given it all of the appropriate values. So I've grabbed first name from whatever they entered in the first name field of the form, last name, phone, email, same thing. That's all stored here. And this might be bad data. So how am I going to now check my form? Well, we don't have a form object at the moment, but we're going to get one. We're going to create a new one by creating forms, our form, which is our variable, and we're going to assign that the value of forms new, and this time we're not going to pass it nil. We're going to pass it postform, r.postform. So this is what has all those URL values and the associated data. So this is created by calling forms new right over here, and all that does is say, okay, get the data you just passed me, which happened to be r.postform, which is of type URL values, and create the form object and send back a pointer to it. So we have that back in our handlers. We have our form. Now we can actually check things. So the first thing we have over on forms.go is this has. It's the only thing we have that's not new or a type definition. We have this one function, has, and that returns a bool. So let's go back here, and you'll see why we don't have enough. Go back to our handlers, and we want to make sure that it's valid. So I can just say, on this form object I just created, form.has, it should have first name, and I need to pass that by request. So there, I've done that. I've now called form and said, hey, look, does this form have the value first name, and is it something more than an empty string? We check the form post request for the value of first name. Does it have an entry for first name? If it has one and it's empty, return false. Otherwise, return true. So when I call this back over in handlers, I'm calling the function has, but I'm not doing anything with its response. So I probably should make this a little more valid. I need to check if my form is valid. It would be great if I could put whatever checks I want here, as many as I might have 10, I might have 3, and then just say if not form.valid, do something. In other words, you failed form validation, but that function doesn't exist yet. So let's go put it in there. Let's go to our forms package, and let's put in this. Func, and it's going to be having the receiver of our form, so we can look at our form data of type form valid. And that's going to return a bool. So I better put my bool in there. All this does is say if there are any errors at all associated with the form object f that I'm getting from my receiver, return the value of false if there are errors and true if there are, if it's valid, if there are no errors, return true. Otherwise, return false. So all I have to do here really is say return the length of f.errors. If that happens to be equal to 0, it's going to return true. Otherwise, it's going to return false. That's a nice shorthand way of doing it. I could have written it over 4 lines, and it would work just as well, but this seems to me to be the simplest approach to do it. So let's do this. Valid returns true if there are no errors. In other words, the form is valid, otherwise false. Okay, so that's great, but the other thing I need to pay attention to is my has check doesn't actually add an error anywhere. It just checks to see if the field exists. So we could do this. We can just go back to here before this return false part and say f.errors, which is my receiver, I'm calling the f object, and that has a function associated with it called add. And I can add my error string, and the add is for the field. When I call it with first name, that is populated with the string value of first name. And now I need to specify the error message, which can be something as simple as this field cannot be blank. All right. So now when I call this, that actually will add an error to it. And that's exactly what I want it to do. So we have our has, we have our new, and our handlers now where you need to keep going. So if the form is not valid, at this point when I call form has now, it's returning a false or a true, which I'm ignoring, but it's also adding an error if first name is empty or non-existent. So what do I want to do if the form is actually has a problem on it? Well, pretty straightforward. Let's first of all create a variable to hold our reservation. And when we're passing data to a template, remember we had that value called data. So if we go over to our template data, here we have this nice one called, where is it? Data, which is a map of string interface. So let's go back to our handlers and create a map of string interface. So I'll call it data is equal to make map string interface. And then I'll add my reservation to that. Data reservation, which is how I'll look it up on the template when I need to, which we're not going to do this lecture, but we will eventually, is equal to reservation, that object I created up here. So now I'm storing that in that value. And now, what do I want to do? If they didn't pass validation, I can't just hand them back to the reservation handler because that's creating an empty form. But what I can do is the similar thing. I can actually render the form right from here. I can say, render that form. And I'm going to pass it not forms new nil. I'm going to pass it form object I created here, which now has an error associated with it because I called the has function. So I can just pass it form. Let me get rid of this and just put my variable form there. And I'm also going to pass it data, which holds this reservation map, or this map that has a value of reservation in it. So now I have the information that the user entered. I have the errors, if any, generated by this, and I re-render that page. And at that point, I want to stop processing this function. I don't want to go any further, so I'll just return. All right, let's see what this does. So far, it's not going to do very much, but let's try it. Let's make sure it compiles. So I'll stop my application. I'll rerun it. It compiled. That's promising. Let's go back over to our make reservation page, reload this, and try submitting it. Hey, it took me back. It didn't do anything. Why not? Because I have no logic on my template to display errors. Well, we can do that, and we can do it really easily. So let's go back over to open up our template, which is the make reservation page. Hide this window. And let's think about how we can actually get access to the reservation object. Probably not this lecture, that'll be the next one, but get access to the errors object. So we can do that pretty easily. What I'm going to do is right at the top here, I'm going to give myself a little bit of space to work. I'm only working with first name right now. And what I want to do is to say, if there's an error associated with first name, I want to display something. And I'm going to stick it right next to the label. So when there's an error, I want the error message to display right here. How am I going to get access to that errors object? Well, we know that we have a form object. So let's just use a new syntax you haven't seen yet, with. And that is a directive for a Golang template. And the language for the structure for it is very simple. With.form.errors.get, and I'm going to look for first name, the name of the field. And that's exactly how I'm storing it in that form object. I'm storing a string, a map of string slice of strings. And I'm saying with form errors get first name, and this has to have an end, like everything else, pretty much everything else in Golang templates. I want to display something. I want to display a label, class equals text danger, which will make it red. That's a bootstrap class. And all I want to display is whatever the value from form errors get first name is. So I'll just display that. And that's all I have to do at this point. But I could do something else. It would be great. Let's just try it like this first. So let me stop the application and run it. Go back here, go to the make reservation page to make sure I'm starting with an empty form, and click make reservation. And it comes back to this form and gives me that error message. Be nice if I could make this be outlined in red as well. Well, it turns out I can pretty easily. And I can do that simply by, in the class for the input, which is right here, I can put more logic in there as well. With .form, which is in our template data, part of our default data, and handed to us by the handler when the form fails validation, errors.get first name. So if that returns true, if there is more than one error, if there's a value stored in form.errors.get first name, that maps string slice of strings, what do I want to do? Well, all I want to do is add a class, and the class is a bootstrap class called isInvalid. And then, of course, I have to have my end. Now, if I do that, and I'll put this down on the next line so it's organized a little better, I should be able to just run this because we're rebuilding our template cache in every request, and it should make this box outlined in red. And it failed. Oh, what did I get wrong? Let's go back here. With form.errors.get first name is invalid end. Okay. Oh, there it is right there. This quotation mark has to be on the outside, otherwise it's invalid HTML. So I have an opening class tag right here, but I never have a closing class tag or a quote for that, so it never ends. And Go, fortunately, is extremely picky about that. So that's right. Let's try this again. Now it'll work. And it does. It gives me the nice little thing right here, the little exclamation mark. It outlines this in red, and it has an error message. All right, so that's how we can do some basic validation. But there are some problems associated with this. For example, I have 4 required fields. And with my current approach, back over here, under my handlers, right here, I would have to, let me just hide this, I would have to do form has first name, form has last name, form has email. That seems really inefficient. It would be better if I could have, say, a different function, or maybe modify this function, something anyway, where I could just pass it any number of required fields. And if any of those fields are not required, it generates an error for that specific field. Well, there has to be a way to do that, and it turns out there is. And we'll do that, and we'll also get around to repopulating our form data with whatever they entered here, because right now if I put Smith and John at smith.ca or whatever and submit the form, I still lose that data, which seems kind of goofy because I've already got it stored in the reservation. There must be a better way of doing this, and in fact there is, and we'll take care of that in the next lecture.